One thing you know from having been through an NDE is that there are other realms, and some of those other realms are more real than this one. In fact, this existence in these bodies in the material realm is murky and dim. That existence is sharp, crisp, alive, detailed, meaningful, transformational, and it's the kind of thing that changes your life forever. The God force of love consciousness is in all of us, and it's what determines the emergent physical reality. All the things we call real are made of substance that is decidedly unreal. Our minds participate in the evolution of the universe, and it's not simply the interaction of material particles. Reincarnation is absolutely a part of human existence, scientifically validated without question. And just because we all forget, for the most part, our past lives doesn't mean they didn't occur. And you can recover those past life memories. The main message I was to bring back to this world is, I think, important to point out, I'd spent my life in a very scientific setting. My family was very scientific. My father, adoptive father, that is a important part of my personal story, is that I was put up for adoption when I was 11 days old. But I was adopted into a wonderful, loving family. My adoptive father happened to be a globally renowned neurosurgeon. And he was very influential on my life, a wonderful person, a very inspiring mentor. My sisters and I all kind of worshiped him as being such a great person. But he was always very comfortable with advanced science. I mean, he was a chairman of a neurosurgical training program in the U.S. He'd been a combat surgeon in the Second World War in the Pacific Theater, and then ran a training program. He was very up to speed on modern science, physics, cosmology, neuroscience, every bit of it. And yet he had a very powerful, pervading belief in God and the power of prayer that helped him a lot in his healing. Now, like for so many of us that grew up in the 60s and 70s, like I did, we knew science is absolutely the pathway to truth. And like so many people, I made the mistake of thinking that science was equal to the kind of popular form of materialist science that you might read about in Scientific American and in the science section of New York Times. Didn't realize that we really had to get deep into some of the modern aspects of science, in particular quantum physics, to even begin to understand the brain-mind relationship. But back in those days, before my coma, really didn't know how incredibly important a lot of that kind of bigger picture thinking was. And so I was a card-toting materialist neuroscientist. That, when I say that, what I mean is the materialist scientist thinks that only the physical or material world exists. And therefore, somehow the brain must be conjuring up consciousness out of purely physical matter. And I never really paid a lot of attention to it before. But of course, that whole statement is really ridden with problems. That physical matter could somehow conjure up consciousness, especially the kind of consciousness that we now realize exists, that is interconnected and far grander than any one little individual consciousness, and is really the mind of the universe that we all seem to share. But, this was back before my coma. I still lived in a little silo that kind of thought that materialist conventional science was correct. And that, of course, is also a science that hasn't even begun to remotely understand what quantum physics is trying to say. And that's why quantum physics is so incredibly important in getting where all this is going, because it tells us a lot about space-time information, the mind-brain relationship. But that was all in the future for me, because my coma journey was the catalyst that opened my eyes to all this. And people often ask me, well, if the you before coma could read your book, Living in a Mindful Universe, would they get it that this is truly a scientific revolution? And I would say absolutely yes. The evidence is all around us, and I just didn't know how to look at the evidence back then. I needed a little thumping, and that came in the form of a severe case of bacterial meningoencephalitis. It put me in coma for a week back in November of 2008. And that was a tremendous turning point in my life and my understanding, basically offering me a 180-degree flip away from materialism and towards a strong recognition that the true philosophical answer is more one of idealism, or if you really want to follow the data, I'd say the best label for it would be evolutionary panentheism. But it's, panentheism is that God force of love consciousness is in all of us, and it's what determines the emergent physical reality. So I was just uh, very much interested in consciousness before, but I had no idea how big the universe and the question of consciousness was. And that's where the 15 years since my coma has been spent working with other scientists and with other experiencers, trying to come up with deeper answers to these questions. And that's what our books, Proof of Heaven, Map of Heaven, and especially Living in a Mindful Universe, are really all about.
Thank you so much for covering that ground. And it's really interesting because, yeah, I think for like I'm looking at it as an engineer by background, we do imagine that software requires hardware to run on. And I think that's the material perspective, right? That we've got matter, we've got mind, and so then we have this phenomenon called consciousness that's there. And it's really trippy to all of a sudden go, actually, everything flips on its head. And maybe that's where they say quantum physics actually flips everything on its head as well, because it seems like there's a sea of software and hardware is actually an emergent phenomenon, which is really trippy to get your head around.
It is fascinating, but ultimately the thing that exists is awareness of existence. That's where we're basically sharing the mind of the universe. And many scientists have been writing books over the last few decades to try and delineate, how is it quantum physics is actually informing us of what's going on? And the most important observation is really that of the original scientists like Erwin Schrödinger and Wolfgang Pauli and um, John von Neumann, Pascal Jordan, and others, all these quantum physicists who said you can't get behind consciousness. Consciousness is fundamental in the universe. And of course, to so many other people, that didn't really make much sense. They didn't know where to go with it. But quantum physics is all about studying the nature of the very substance of that reality around us. And when you start diving deep into those electrons and protons and photons and quarks and every bit of it and dissecting out the stuff, you find that it's not real in the same sense that, our chairs and tables and trees and clouds are real. That subatomic stuff can be in multiple places at once in the form of superposition. You can have particles entangled in the same subatomic process, photons or electrons or what have you, that then become entangled so that as they travel across the universe, they maintain a relationship with each other that really continues kind of with the apparent reality that they remain the same particle, but they're now split in space and time. So there are these phenomena of quantum physics that, as Niels Bohr, one of the founding fathers, and especially the father of what's called the Copenhagen interpretation, which is probably the most popular uh, modern interpretation of the measurement paradox in quantum physics. But he said that the things around us, what they're made of, all the things we call real, are made of substance that is decidedly unreal because of the entanglement and the superposition and those very odd kind of characteristics of subatomic particles. And that's really kind of the nature of it. It turns out it's all being generated within mind, within that mental field. And that's what they were recognizing and acknowledging that information had this kind of special category that was beyond just the meanderings of matter in four-dimensional space-time. And that's where it all becomes much more exciting. Because one thing from having been through an NDE is that there are other realms, and some of those other realms are more real than this one. And that's why it's so important to get. We're not just talking about explaining the material world that we live in, although that is a key part of all this kind of explanation and exploration, but that ultimately we're trying to explain everything else about human experience too. And that includes those extraordinary journeys that people report, in the process of dying or almost dying. So They can be a tremendous wake-up call that the universe is far grander than the puny little version that we witness just living these material lives on Earth.
Hey there, guys. I know you're loving this podcast with Dr. Eben, and I won't interrupt you for too long, but I will take a quick sec to ask for a humble request. Please take a moment to hit subscribe to the channel. Everything you see around here is powered and empowered by your subscription. At the time of this recording, 85% of you are returning to the channel but haven't yet hit subscribe, and we can see that at the back end. So please do us a favor, hit subscribe. Thank you so much in advance. Back to today's episode. Yeah, we interviewed Nassim Haramein, who's a bit of a quantum physicist, and he was talking about how somehow he's done some maths, and we see 13% of what we really are in this experience, and the rest of it, I asked him questions, and he was like, it was a really fascinating podcast. But one of the interesting things I always end up reflecting on when it comes to quantum physics is the observer effect, like you were mentioning Schrodinger before, and just the concept that the observer plays such a pivotal role in the experience of consciousness and what actually, what results you get. And just the trippy dippy thought that comes to me is like, if everybody in the whole world, or maybe the universe, just shut their eyes at the same time and just went inwards, does the external what happens to the external universe? Like, what happens when we stop observing? It's such a trippy idea. Talking about that though, I would love to, because there was a point. Your NDE was well. Let's describe it a little bit if you don't mind, and then I can ask some questions about it. You mentioned meningitis. You going through and a couple of things stacked in on top of it. But now I'm giving your answer for you. So. Tell us a little bit about your NDE, what was going on to you physically, but then also like what went on. Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, very important to point out, there was one atypical feature of my near-death experience that is really unusual. And I always remind people that a near-death experience is first and foremost tailored for the soul that's having it. They don't have any other reason for being, although they are very instructive, especially when we review near-death experiences in large numbers. They're very instructive about the nature of reality and telling us much more about who we are and what this is all about. And so in that sense, I think my amnesia was important for me as a neuroscientist, neurosurgeon, trying to understand all this. That amnesia was a key demonstration, especially because all those memories were deleted. My entire life history was gone from my awareness during my NDE, and you don't hear about that as a common feature of NDEs. But then all the memories came back over about 2 months after my coma. In fact, when I woke up from coma, I didn't even recognize my mother, my sisters, my sons at the bedside. My brain was still so savaged by the infection that I didn't know who they were. All I knew was where I had just been. But my language, my personal memories, all that started coming back very, very quickly after I woke up. But setting the stage, when it all started, I was completely amnesic. I had no language. I had no knowledge of Earth, humans, this universe. It really was an empty slate. And I think that was a very important kind of going back to square one to help me kind of put the pieces together and decide what was real and not real in this universe. But having to start over with, absolutely nothing as a get-go. So in that setting of complete amnesia, I became aware in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive kind of subterranean realm. I remember having no body awareness during any part of the 7-day coma, zero. But I was a speck of awareness, so I was witnessing things. And what I witnessed early on in that earthworm eye view was this kind of murky, dark, subterranean existence. If I had just gone there and come back to this world, I would have had a hellish NDE or, a distressing NDE. But that's not what happened. I was rescued by this slowly spinning white light that had an appearance like ground glass, and it had fine silvery and golden tendrils coming off of it. And it came towards me slowly spinning. And as it approached, I recognized that there was a musical melody. And that that was very important because so far in this earthworm eye view, the kind of acoustic presence had been this steady pounding, like somebody smashing an anvil. It was very disconcerting. And yet now here comes this beautiful spinning light that comes packaged with a perfect musical melody. And that musical melody proves important in the future because it helped me when I would go up to these highest levels in the spiritual realm, and then I'd spontaneously tumble back down to that earthworm eye view. But by recalling the musical notes of the memory in my mind, that's what would conjure up that light portal, so that each and every time I was able to ascend back up. And the back up was into this beautiful ultra real gateway valley. Now, many people hear about NDEs and they think, oh, they must be very murky and dreamlike and kind of dim. No, they're the exact opposite of that. In fact, this existence in these bodies in the material realm is murky and dim. That existence is sharp, crisp, alive, detailed, meaningful, transformational, and it's the kind of thing that changes your life forever. And people remember NDEs, 50 years later as if they just happened yesterday. So that's what I was going through. So now I'm up into that beautiful gateway valley. I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in vast formations. And we were above this incredibly gorgeous meadow. And in the meadow, it was surrounded by forest. There were sparkling waterfalls and the crystal blue pools. And there were thousands of people dancing in this meadow. And what I called all that when I was writing it all up weeks later after I came back to this world, trying to record my journey, I said they were souls between lives in this beautiful meadow. But there was lots of joy and merriment, incredible festivities. I remember children playing, dogs jumping, and it was all being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs that were emanating chants and anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. And all this may sound foreign to people, but an interesting thing is when you're there, it's like, oh, I'm finally home. You remember all of this. It feels so much like your spiritual home, and the memories come back. There are reasons why we tend to forget all this stuff when we're in these material bodies. But the reality is we can remind ourselves of it through centering prayer, meditation, having NDEs, what have you. But that's what I was going through, was this incredible, oh my God, now I remember. And as a speck of awareness on the butterfly wing, the best news was I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful young woman, sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, high cheekbones, broad smile. She was dressed in the same kind of simple yet colorful garb of all those people dancing in the meadow down below. And she was sitting beside me, and she looked at me with a look of pure love, and she never said a word. She didn't have to. Her thoughts, her emotional truth and awareness pounded deeply into this mind meld with me. And her message to me, as I wrote it all up weeks later, because it came as a pure telepathic conceptual flow. So I said she never mouthed a word at all. But her message, which I think was the main message I was to bring back to this world, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for. And as I put it in the book, Proof of Heaven, the other part of that message is you can do no wrong. Well, I wish I had explained that last sentence a little better. I thought people would get it by this point, that I was in this realm of pure love with that God love force, and that, with this loving guardian angel with me, that I knew that the deeds of our lives measured in that realm, like in a life review. That's where a life review would happen. Your life flashed before your eyes. It's all about love and kindness, compassion. So to the extent that we as souls have lived our life expressing love and kindness, compassion, acceptance, mercy on all our fellow beings, unconditional love, then fine, so be it. But to the extent that we might have made choices otherwise, for example, maybe followed our ego and handed out pain and suffering, showed greed and selfishness to others, that's a very wrong kind of thing to be doing in that environment. So, in other words, there is a right and wrong from the perspective of this world. From the perspective of that world, all you're witnessing is this incredible beauty and love and connection. But recognizing that life reviews offer a course correction for us to come more into a mode of loving and caring for each other. Anyway, big, huge topic, the binding force of love in that environment, and what it shows to us about getting together and living together and taking care of each other. So anyway, in this Gateway Valley, um, that was a gateway, and I was moving on to the next level. And I remember a soft summer breeze that blew through, and it was my first awareness of that divine God force that was going through all of this scene, all through the lowest kind of material realm and all into the highest levels where I was still headed. And so in this beautiful valley with these angelic choirs above, they provided yet another musical portal. And what I witnessed was all of four-dimensional space-time, the material world, which was apparent below the spiritual level, all of that collapsed down. And then the spiritual level with a completely different ordering of time, very important to stress. Deep time or meta time is what I call it. And what that means is when you're there, birth, death, everything in between can be simultaneously presented to you. And that should tell you there's something big going on here. It's not just, oh, yeah, life over there is just like life over here, just a little different. No, it's very different, especially because of that interconnection across all the events of your life. That it starts to become apparent much more what your soul journey is and what you've been able to do and where you've also been lacking. These things all become very apparent in that kind of an environment. So in this Gateway Valley, all of that is collapsing down. That spiritual realm with its meta time or deep time collapsing down. And as I ascended through this light portal that was provided by by those angels that were emanating these chants and hymns, and that's when I entered what I call the core. The core was as far as I went, but it's about as far as I could imagine going. It was a realm of pure oneness with that divine loving God force. The entire multiverse through all eternity was theirs as complex oversphere, as part of lessons to be learned and taught. And I was told going into the core realm, you're not here to stay, but you'll be going back. We'll teach you many things. And then there were all these cycles through these various levels with the lessons that I learned. And that, of course, has been the substance of so much of what I've talked about. But I want to mention in particular some observations from that core realm. One, the most important, is that I recognize it's a resolution of all dualities. So that, in our world, we have masculine, feminine, dark, light, good, evil, all these different gradations of qualities and quantities and things. But when you get to that point in the core, all of that became one. And I also recognize that my very conscious awareness, and this is not Eben Alexander's little ego mind, but this is my higher soul mind, that conscious awareness is directly sourced in the God force. That pure, infinitely loving, co-creative God force is where our awareness even comes from. So we're never separate from that. That's the important thing. People feel in this world that, with all the polarization and conflict and kind of apparent darkness and evil, where is this God? Well, this God force is right there at the core of our conscious awareness. This is where centering prayer and meditation become very important because the more you explore consciousness, the more you're able to identify these facets of your higher soul that overlap with basically the God force mind of the universe, and with all of our fellow beings. So that's an important uh, condition, is that this mind that we're postulating, this God mind, is actually a universal mind that we all share. So anyway, in ascending into that core realm, there were other visions I had that were very important, especially in terms of the fact that I didn't have Eben Alexander's memory, so I couldn't have an Eben Alexander life review. But what I did have was a generic version of life review that was much grander, that showed me this bigger condition that allows for our higher soul to go through all these events, and for that to be who we are, the part of us that's doing the growing and the transforming. And specifically, there were two visions I had in that core realm that showed me reincarnation and life reviews. Given that I couldn't have an Eben Alexander life review, I've had the evidence for life reviews uh, very purely demonstrated. And one was what I call the flying fish version, just like it sounds, flying fish down in the water, like us down in our bodies in the material realm. But then between lives, we pop up, have reunite with souls of departed loved ones, go through life reviews, plan next incarnations, then dive back in. But the much bigger vision that came on a later passage through the core was what I call the Indra's net vision, and that was a much more complete vision of interwoven threads of our lives, and I could see the very weave and flow of the threads in this beautiful tapestry were our lives. And it was almost like breathing, breathe in, breathe out. The breathe in was the inhalation, being down in a physical body, living this life. Then the exhale was between lives in the spiritual form, reunited with souls of departed loved ones, life reviews, planning next incarnations for what lessons to be learned and taught, then diving back in. But there is program forgetting. Most people today will tell you, well, I don't remember past lives. I don't think past lives are real. Well, guess what? Program forgetting is very real. And if you talk to people like Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, who have done the past life memories in children research for the last 6 decades at the University of Virginia here, Division of Perceptual Studies, you can go to uvadops.org to learn a whole lot more about their work. But you'll find that of the 2,700 or so cases of past life memories in children that they've investigated in the last 6.5 decades, that in fact 1,700 of those cases are solved. That is, they actually found the person who the child is describing, that person actually lived. And a lot of the details, names, events, you know, relatives,
Whoa.
friends, causes of death, et cetera, all of that is borne out by the testimony of these children describe it, but then you find in scientific research that you can identify the person actually lived. But what they tell you, what Jim Tucker and Ian Stevenson tell you, is you must harvest these memories before age 6 or 7, because after that age, we have natural processes that cover over our memories. So that gives us skin in the game. So we buy into this existence as our only existence. But there are many children out there who have stories of past lives, and it just so happens that when scientists investigate them, you find out it's real. So reincarnation is absolutely a part of human existence, scientifically validated without question. And if you don't know that fact, you're going to be cheating yourself trying to understand the nature of reality and especially the brain mind connection and the nature of consciousness. So you need to understand reincarnation is part of the package. And just because we all forget, for the most part, our past lives doesn't mean they didn't occur. And the scientific study of all this stuff demonstrates you can recover those past life memories, like through hypnotic regression, through meditation and centering prayer. There are many ways to uncover them, but this is kind of given the bigger context. And then to kind of get to the end of this story, I cycled through multiple times. There's so much more to talk about, tremendous amount of information. But essentially, it was showing me an extraordinary journey of my mind through the universe at a time when my brain was way too sick to be participating in that. And that's the important thing. I describe the medical details of my case in the book Proof of
Very
Heaven, but in
openly.
addition, there is a medical case
Mm.
report that was written on my medical records. It was written by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery. And they make it very clear in an article by Dr. Serbi Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson, published in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease in September of 2018. They make it crystal clear that my brain was in no shape to harbor any dream or hallucination. That's the thing that got my attention when I was first studying my own medical records. Was I had this fascinating, incredibly rich, multi-layered experience that happened at a time when my brain was very demonstrably far too damaged to have any kind of dream or hallucination. That's why the scientific community takes my story very seriously. and why I've had to take it seriously and pay a tremendous amount of attention to it over these 15 years when I've worked with other scientists and other experiencers in trying to better explain these kind of things and the nature of reality and what they're telling us about humanity and about our existence.
And so you're deep, deep, deep within this realm, and there's some really, there's very many fascinating things that we can unpack from there. And it sounds like you were in there for a very, very, very long time. Back here on Earth, what's going on and how did you come back? How long were you actually in this experience in Earth time?
Well, I was in coma for 7 days, and there were a lot of family at the bedside. And that's kind of an interesting part because at the very end of it, I've described most of the coma journey to you, at least in kind of a broad strokes. But I guess important to point out that at the very end of it, I'd been told you're not here to stay in that core realm. And there came a point where trying to conjure up the musical notes again for that musical melody that had first ushered me up from Earth Were My View to the Gateway Valley, it didn't work. They told me you're not here to stay, so I guess I should have known at some point that would happen. To say I was sad at that time would be an understatement, but I also knew I could trust I would be taken care of. I had no doubt about that, given my prior passages through the Gateway Valley and the core. And it was at that point that I saw thousands of beings going off around me into the distance, heads bowed, many holding candles, and this murmuring energy coming from them. The interesting thing to me was now all of a sudden here I was back in that kind of Earth Were My View where it all started, but the murmuring energy coming from them brought the same sense of love, connection, and togetherness that I'd felt initially on coming up into the Gateway Valley in the core. But now I was getting it down in this lowest level, and it appeared to be coming through all these beings around me. What I called that when I came back to this world was the power of prayer. That's what I was witnessing, was their prayers getting to me and kind of helping to guide me back to that realm. In addition, the very last thing I saw were six faces that would bubble up out of the muck, and I can remember them today as clearly as if this all happened yesterday. I mean, these are not vague memories; they're very strong. But when it all happened, I didn't recognize them. My amnesia was still powerful, and it turns out they were people, family, friends who were there in the ICU room the last 24 to 48 hours of coma. So that proved to me that the vast majority of the coma journey had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5. I explain all the timing of that in the book Proof of Heaven and in Living in a Mindful Universe. Um, but that was what I was witnessing was these six faces. One of them was of a family friend who I had known going all the way back to 1972, freshman year in college in UNC Chapel Hill. Susan Renchis and I were in the same English class. Then we lost touch with each other, but then later reacquainted because she taught at Ravenscroft School with my former spouse, and they became close friends. And that's when my former spouse learned that Susan had done work in channeling, going channeling to help people, and including a lot of people in coma. And so my family had actually contacted Susan while I was in coma, asked her to channel to me, which she did on nights 4 and 5. And I remember her as much as I remember any of the other people who were physically there. So when I woke up from coma in the hours when my language and memories were starting to come back to me, I said, "But where was Susan? She was there too." And they said, "Well, she wasn't physically here. She was 120 miles away in Chapel Hill, but she channeled to you on nights 4 and 5." So that, and I've said, of course, well, and where I was, you don't have to be spatially nearby at all. There's no distance impediment in that realm. So anyway, but it was the last face I saw that's the most important. The last of the six. It was of a 10-year-old boy. It was my son Bond. And I didn't recognize him at the time because my amnesia was still in power. But he was pleading with me. It was Sunday morning. The doctors had just held a family conference, day 7 of coma. I was showing no signs of improvement, had been on a ventilator 7 days, 3 powerful intravenous antibiotics, not showing any positive neurologic signs. The doctor said I'd gone from a 10% chance of survival down to a 2% chance, but no chance of recovery. So they recommended stopping antibiotics. Now, they had protected Bond from the worst news during most of the week, but now he heard that. He was outside the room, heard the doctor saying it was time to let me go. All of a sudden, it was much worse than he'd been told. So he came running down the hallway, pulled open my eyelids that were taped shut. One eye looking over there, one eye over there, neither pupil working. Anybody in medicine knows that's a horrible picture. And I promise you, I didn't hear him with my ears or seeing with my eyes. I was far too gone from this world in the dying process. But his pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. Somehow that got through. And although this entire adventure, because of my amnesia and no sense of responsibility to any other souls, I had thought this can continue, it can cease, doesn't matter. Well, guess what? Now everything mattered. There was another soul out there who needed me. Bond's pleading, even though I didn't understand the words, I could understand the kind of feeling of his plead, and it was to come back. And so I knew I had to somehow work my way back to that world. And that's when I came back and woke up on that bed, started fighting the ventilator, and that's when they pulled out the breathing tube. And I said, thank you. But at that point, I'm still not recognizing loved ones. And interestingly enough, my brain was still so damaged, I ended up having a paranoid delusional psychotic nightmare that lasted for about 36 hours, even after coma. Interesting thing to me, as much as when I got home, I started writing down everything I could remember, the deep coma spiritual memories and also these paranoid delusional psychotic nightmare memories from post coma. It turns out that I was completely, you know, comfortable coming back to this world. I remember my sister Phyllis, my youngest sister, who got there about 20, 30 minutes after I was extubated. She said I was sitting on the bed like a little Buddha, and I was looking at everyone there, doctor, nurse, family, friend, what have you, and I'd look them in the eyes and I'd say, all is well. Don't worry. All is well. And she said it was so bizarre because, they'd been so worried about me dying from this horrible meningitis. And then I'm sitting on the bed reassuring all of them that everything is just fine, not to worry. So anyway, it took 2 months for all the memories to come back. When they did, it turns out they're more complete than the memories had been before my coma. That's a kind of a stunning, oh my God, realization. And yet, to me, it's a fact that demands explanation. Why is it that my memories were more complete after they all came back to me? We talk about that in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, how memories are not even stored in the brain. And that is one of the last nails in the coffin of materialist neuroscience. But of course, when you recognize all those uh, past life memories in children, you realize, of course, memories cannot be stored in the brain because there was no brain that they had between lives to store those memories in. So memories are stored in a field of information. I would say the quantum hologram is the name of that field. And I take that term from a paper by Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut, and Bob Starretts. They wrote a chapter in a book called Universe of Consciousness, something like that. And in that chapter, they use the phrase quantum hologram, which is what I use for that, labeling that memory field. But anyway, I've worked on this now for 15 years, worked with scientists around the world. If you go to GalileoCommission.org or scientificandmedical.net, you'll see a lot more of the scientific groups that I serve as an advisor for. And you'll realize this is truly a scientific revolution. We're moving away from materialism, which has been proven false. In fact, the Nobel Prize Committee, in 2022, giving out the Nobel Prize for entanglement in quantum physics was a giant step forward to say, well, we've given up on materialism. It is not true. There's a much deeper form of reality. We have to get rid of the concept of local realism. That's what bothered Einstein so much about entanglement, spooky action at a distance, as he called it. And yet every single experiment has proven that entanglement is the real phenomenon. Spooky action at a distance is true. Not Einstein's idea that maybe it was hidden variables, because all the experiments done, the Bell experiments as they're called, since the early 1970s, have revealed that entanglement is absolutely real. And entanglement is a statement that local realism of physics, that is, local is that all physics is interactive particles touching each other, so it's local. And realism is the notion that an objective physical world exists independent of our observations. But quantum physics tells us no, no, your observations are what create what is observed. You talked earlier about the observer and the observed, and the fascinating thing here is the observer is actually creating the emerging reality. The way, for example, John Wheeler put it, he was the head of physics at Princeton, uh, involved in the Manhattan Project, very knowledgeable about quantum physics. He called it the participatory anthropic principle, which is basically just pointing out that our minds, the anthropic part of that, our minds participate in the evolution of the universe. And it's not simply the interaction of material particles, but there's something more to it, this mental layer. And that's where I think the scientific revolution is so important because of where it's leading us towards concepts of love and oneness.
What does this do for our relationship with death? How do you perceive death now? Because it seems almost like it's not an end. So can you tell us more about what people can deduce about the nature of death? Because I think there's so much fear around that for so many people.
Well, what I can tell you is death is a transition. It's actually a liberation from the shackles of the physical brain and body that are more like a prison than anything else. And that's what we can discover through meditation and centering prayer. You can start to explore those outer reaches of your mental universe and recognize that the brain is a filter.
Hey there, guys. Dr. Eben's own NDE and everything that he studied is just so interesting about death and the transition and everything. I'd love to hear from you in the comment section below your own experiences with NDEs, what you're taking away from this particular podcast and Dr. Eben's NDE or the NDEs that he studied. Yeah, leave me a comment below. That's me writing back to you, and I'd love to hear from you. Back to today's episode.
The way to picture it is that your brain is a transceiver or filter that allows a dissociation of a little bit, a little eddy current of consciousness from that primordial mind, that God mind that I've been talking about. And so the brain treats that little eddy current as your consciousness, but it's not ever really separate from that grander consciousness. That's the important thing. And that's where in dreams, in psychedelic experiences, in centering prayer, meditation, what have you, we can start finding evidence that our consciousness is connected to that larger God mind and that we're never separate from it. And this is really a model that is taking the world by storm in the scientific world about consciousness. Filter theory, as it's kind of loosely called, we talk about it a lot in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. And it's not a new concept. Filter theory was very popular in the late 1800s, early 1900s. For example, um, um, William James, the head of psychology at Harvard, who is the head of psychology in North America, he talked about filter theory to explain a lot of the kind of spiritual situations that he encountered in patients. Likewise, F.C.S. Schiller, Frederick W.H. Meyer, Henri Bergson in France, and Aldous Huxley in the United States, who wrote the book Doors of Perception. That was about his experiences under the influence of mescaline. And he makes it very clear that the brain is just a filter that's allowing this primordial consciousness to give us access to it, but we have access beyond our own minds by meditative prayer techniques, etc., to get more in touch with his higher soul and with this kind of primordial mind that I'm talking about. That's exactly what happens in an NDE. So when you die, you don't fear, termination or end of relationships, because what happens is a broadening of your ability to kind of expand and reconnect with souls who have left the physical plane, still connect with souls that are embodied in the physical plane, and everything in between. And so this it just shows us that we are much grander beings than just a material body that only has access to a here now and a sense of self.
Because looking at your medical results as well, you were yeah, there was so much physical damage that had happened to you that this the concept of awareness becomes really interesting looking at your particular case as a case study, because the way you're describing it, you were, I don't even want to use the word hyper, but you were hyper aware, but your hardware was completely broken down, and yet you had the most vivid experience of the software ever.
Well, I think part of the picture is, near-death experiences are not complete dying experiences. So I think if I had gone on to die in that particular episode, that the blinders would have come off and those memories would have returned and my kind of higher soul would have expressed all that. But no, this was a deep dive, but one from which I was meant to come back. And by doing so, I was also meant to harvest the lessons that one can harvest. I mean, NDEs are an incredible teacher. And the more NDEers I talk to, the more I get a more complete picture of what I think is this reality for spiritual beings, that we're spiritual beings in a spiritual universe. And that certainly includes the material universe and explains a lot of how it works, but also includes much higher levels of understanding. And I'll give you a quick example of why that kind of thing is important from a scientific perspective. That has to do with a number of scientific papers in the last 12 years looking at people under the influence of psilocybin, magic mushrooms, LSD, DMT, other serotonin 2A psychedelic substances. Because what they show, as much as a person taking such a substance might think that their brain is lighting up like a Christmas tree, what they actually find is the brain is going dark. If you use functional MRI, magnetoencephalography, these very advanced techniques we have for looking at the action of neurons in the brain while it's thinking and working, you find that under the influence of these substances, the brain goes dark. It disconnects from itself. The default mode network, which is a very established network that probably represents our kind of ego sense of self and of being here and now, dissolves completely. In fact, there's no neuronal population anywhere in the brain that increases activity while you're on these substances. So if you as a neuroscientist were hoping to use functional MRI and magnetoencephalography to delineate exactly how the brain was generating these phenomenal experiences, you're out of luck because the brain is not doing it. And that is a very important kind of a lesson about the bigger picture here. When I read those papers initially, the first one that came out in 2012 from Imperial College of London, Robin Carhart Harris, I just was over the moon because to me, it made perfect sense. I knew what happened when meningitis took down my neocortex, how that expanded tremendously my kind of phenomenal experience, way beyond anything I'd ever been through. Way too real to be real. That's how I put it to my son, who was majoring in neuroscience at the time. But in describing my NDE when he came home to me one day after I got out of the hospital, I said it was way too real to be real. My doctors had already told me the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks so you can forget about it. But they didn't also realize how extensive my journey was and how that happened with all these medical details proving that my brain could not have handled a dream or hallucination, much less this extraordinary conveyance of a kind of phenomenal experience that I witnessed on my NDE. So that was the deep lesson to me, was how profound an experience I could have when my brain was definitely turned off. And in fact, in that medical case report, that's one of the big points they make, is that this brain was in no shape to provide any kind of dream or hallucination. But not only that, when challenged by the peer review editors of the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, how do you explain this miraculous recovery? Unprecedented in the medical literature, the authors of the paper said it's because he had a near death experience. That's why he had this profound spiritual recovery. They knew of other similar cases. For example, Anita Morjani, who wrote the book Dying to Be Me, had a profound NDE with a very advanced lymphoma. She should have been dead within hours, but she had the spiritual experience that allowed her to get rid of the lymphoma, come back healed. Or Dr. Mary C. Neal, she wrote the book To Heaven and Back. And she had an over 30-minute warm water drowning while kayaking in Chile in the late 1990s, brought to the surface dead. Well, they resuscitated her. She ended up making a full recovery, going back to orthopedic surgery, and like me and like Anita Morjani, going around the world sharing our beautiful experiences of spiritual healing from diseases that we shouldn't have been able to heal from. So, this is the big, powerful lesson to all of us, that there is spiritual healing that's available to all of us. And as we come to acknowledge kind of our role as higher soul and start to see this grander vision for self, we can start to bring love and healing and wholeness into our lives much more effectively through prayer and meditation. And for me as a healer, as a doctor, makes a big difference in informing me how much power people have to contribute in their own healing.
Yeah, because I'm imagining with your background as a neurosurgeon, you looking at your own, having the vivid experience that you've had on the other side of the coma, and then also the person that you were prior to the coma, and then trying to reconcile everything from like a really grounded scientific standpoint. Like, were you your own biggest skeptic at some point in terms of?
Well, I was. In fact, I use those very words, especially because at the get-go, when I tried to explain all this to my doctors, they said the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks so you can forget about it. We don't even understand how you're coming back to us. Your brain was soaking in pus. This is unprecedented in the medical literature, but you can forget about all that spiritual, crazy woo-woo stuff because that's the brain playing tricks on you. Well, I bought that until I realized just how sick my brain was when I started going into the medical records and talking over with my doctors, going through the CT and MRI scans, realizing there was no place in my brain for this to happen. It was far too damaged. And that's when I realized, well, you've got to go much deeper than just think the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks or think it was way too real to be real. In fact, it was my discovery of that beautiful identity of the guardian angel on the butterfly wing, which I did not discover until I got a picture in the mail 4 months after my coma. And that is how the book Proof of Heaven comes to an end. That was the oh my God moment when I realized it seemed way too real to be real because it really happened. And that part, ever since, has been an extraordinary gift to finally accept it and then start working on, well, great, how do I explain it all? And that's where I've gained so much support and help from the scientific community coming up with this, because there are hundreds of scientists around the world working on this very challenge. And I always like to remind people that you and your audience can glean some of the great benefits of those scientists if you go to bigelowinstitute.org, because Robert Bigelow ran a contest back in 2021 where he said, if you've got more than 5 years of rigorous research experience studying the afterlife question, I want your answer to what's the best scientific proof for the existence of continuing conscious awareness after permanent bodily death. And in that setting, they got 204 essays. He was going to give out 3 monetary awards, but the essays were so good, they ended up giving out 29 monetary awards. They're all available for free to the reading public right now at bigelowinstitute.org. When you start reading them, you will realize science has already established very strongly the reality of the afterlife. It's beyond any doubt. Not only that, reincarnation is a huge part of that literature. So if you go into bigelowinstitute.org and start reading these papers, first place essay by Jeffrey Mishlove, you'll realize the answers are already there. It's real. No doubt about the afterlife. It's an absolute fact of human existence, scientifically validated. But we don't understand it yet. And when you read those papers, you'll realize, yes, they point out the reality of the afterlife, but understanding it and reincarnation and the nature of consciousness and the brain-mind relationship, there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done. But in terms of scientific validation of the reality of the afterlife, that's already right there in the bigelowinstitute.org essays.
One of the other award winners we've had from the Bigelow Institute essays is Pim van Lommel. He came onto the
Oh, yeah.
podcast and whoa, he studied.
Him is
Oh my
incredible. He
god!
won second place, and his essay is rock solid,
Yeah,
very scientific. Of course, he's renowned because he wrote a paper that was published in the very esteemed journal Lancet back in 2001 about his experiences with near-death experiences in a large population of cardiac arrest patients in the Netherlands. It was a landmark paper, and then Pim's book, Consciousness Beyond Life, I highly, highly recommend to people. It's one of the best books on the science of consciousness in the modern era. And also at the end of Pim Van Lommel's essay, a Bigelow essay, he gets to the one mind hypothesis and says that's really where it looks like all this is headed. And he gives 4 resources for the one mind hypothesis. He lists Bernardo Kastrup's paper, The Universe in Consciousness, which in a 2018 Journal of Consciousness Studies publication. Then there's also Spiritual Science by Steve Taylor. There's also the book One Mind by Dr. Larry Dossey. And our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, Pim Van Lommel also says is one of those top resources on the primordial mind hypothesis. So Pim is a wonderful soul and a great scientist, has done an incredible job to help wake this world up to the reality of near-death experiences.
Yeah, and we had a really great chat on the podcast. One of the questions that emerges from that space for you, Eben, is that you've been studying NDEs quite, I'll use the word religiously. Why not? Yourself. Yeah, and so what are some of the commonalities? You've described a lot of them thus far. This one mind is a huge component. But yeah, I think it's a worthwhile question asking. What are some of the commonalities around the NDEs?
I would simply say to anybody interested, there are thousands and thousands of NDEs that are available. If you go to IANDS.org, that's the International Association of Near-Death Studies.org, you can leave your stories there, and there are many there, plus lots of other information about NDEs. Also, NDERF.org. That's a research foundation site from Jeffrey and Jody Long. He's a physician. They've worked on these for decades now, and excellent resource. And then, of course, there are books that summarize the experiences. Also, I love Gregory Shushan's work because he looks at Aboriginal or primitive cultures and their experience with NDEs. But what you find when you look at this really big canvas of all these NDEs throughout all cultures across thousands of years, across all continents, is you find that they most commonly involve a transition from darkness into light. There's a definite sense of going to another realm, and that other realm has great support for its being a unified, very real realm. It's like our material world, but even more real in many ways. So we can learn a lot about how that realm works. It's a timeless realm. It's completely outside of our Earth time. But also, most importantly, from Shushan and others, is the hallmark of a near-death experience is encountering the souls of departed loved ones. And that occurs across all cultures, thousands of years into the past. That is it. And of course, the me before my coma would have told you, oh, yes, that's wishful thinking, blah, blah, blah. Well, the me after coma tells you that's the imprimatur. That means you're having a real experience. It happened to my own mother, as an example. My mother, who was 99 years old in April of 2019, was on her deathbed. She spent her last 4 days deeply unresponsive with fever and a pulmonary infection. But on the second night before she passed, she woke up, got out of bed, which her nurse says was impossible, woke up the nurse at 2:30 in the morning and said, my mother's here, call my children right now, she's really here. And of course, the nurse did not call us. Mom went back to her bed and then was unresponsive and died a day and a half later. But when I heard that story from the nurse, I knew this was it. This was the real deal, that she was going to be passing because she really saw her mother's soul. I know that for a fact. After everything I've been through in this business, I know that when my mother saw her mother, it was an absolutely real experience. I tell a similar story in Proof of Heaven of a good friend of mine who was head of one of the top neurosurgical programs on earth. But when he was with his father had an experience where he witnessed his mother, that would be the grandmother, my friend, right at the foot of the bed. And my friend was absolutely convinced that the father knew she was there, even though he couldn't see her. That is, the friend couldn't see her. and he passed very peacefully. It was the most amazing thing to go through. And my friend had no idea how to interpret that story and what he'd seen his father go through with this incredible deathbed vision of his own mother, who he had actually been with during the Holocaust. That is, the patient who was dying there in that story was with the mother. He was 14 years old when she was killed in a concentration camp. He never talked about her until he was on her deathbed when she appeared to him. And to my friend, that was an amazing story that he finally understood once he heard about my NDE. He knew it was real and that his father witnessed her soul actually being there.
Can you describe terminal lucidity a little bit to us, please, as well, while we're here?
Yes, terminal lucidity or paradoxical lucidity is the other name for it. It's a fantastic phenomenon of exactly this, of people witnessing things right before they die. The story I just shared of my friend, the colleague, the neuroscientist whose father died right before his eyes in this beautiful, peaceful way, that was terminal lucidity. And I've heard many of these cases, and basically you can have somebody who's been in coma for weeks, months, even years, but as they approach death, and statistically, it is a much more likely the last week and especially the last 24 hours before dying that someone will wake up from this prolonged coma and show good memory. They communicate with loved ones at the bedside, often with a sense of great joy and kind of peace, and then leave this world. So terminal lucidity is a kind of this wake-up call, and it completely defies materialist expectations, of saying the brain creates consciousness. Terminal lucidity tells you in very loud fashion, no, not at all. The brain is a filter that allows primordial consciousness to manifest. But no, it is not producing consciousness at all. So terminal lucidity or paradoxical lucidity has been reported, especially more recently with this focus on investigating consciousness and near-death experiences and all of that. I'm familiar, especially with a paper by Bruce Grayson and Michael Nahm, NAHM, that came out I think about 10 years ago, but it was on terminal lucidity and described, 70 or 80 cases going back through history. But now there are people who are studying and providing databases of terminal lucidity in the modern era. So you can find databases where people can report these kinds of terminal lucidity or paradoxical lucidity episodes. And they do a world of good in helping us to realize that the materialist model of brain creates consciousness is completely false. And we need to move to more mature and coherent models that explain consciousness and the brain-mind relationship. But it's not brain creates consciousness. We've moved beyond that.
Hey, you're Inspired Tribe. I want to take a quick sec. I wanted to share something today with you that is really dear to my heart, and it's actually what keeps the entire ecosystem around the Inspired Evolution thriving, my one-on-one coaching. So it's basically coaching that helps you live a spiritually aligned life. I coach people from all different types of walks of life. These people are leaders and they're looking to have an incredible spiritual impact in the lives that they're leading for themselves, and then also lead in alignment to their values. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Here's a few people that have also transformed through my coaching, and here's what they have to say.
Amrit is a fantastic coach.
In a few sessions, he got to a depth that I'd only experienced before working with certain medicines.
He's gone through a lot of the struggles that you're probably facing.
Then my corporate banking job wasn't really doing it.
You feel like you're not making progress towards your goals.
And Amrit's been a really strong, supportive figure in my journey.
I'm more in control of myself.
I'm kinder to myself.
I actually have that vision and a purpose.
I do feel like I'm a better version of myself already.
Amazing energy.
He was easy to talk to, which made me easy to trust him.
Working with Amrit at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and really I was bouncing out of bed.
Whenever I get off the calls with Amrit, best money we've ever spent.
I would not recommend him because I don't want everyone to know about him, and then I won't be able to book him. If he gets too busy, I won't get my turn.
I would say absolutely.
There's no way you can work with Amrit for a period of time without being transformed.
So if you're considering him as a coach, do not hesitate, because you won't be disappointed.
As you guys can see, there's a lot of people all over the world from all these different corners experiencing incredible transformations. I don't think, if I can say humbly myself, that there is anything quite like this somewhere else online. Most people that, have channels that, grow and grow and grow don't really focus on one-to-one offerings. I have just found that it is the most profound space where you can bring yourself in a private container and really just share what's going on for yourself. And if you want to book in for that call with me, touch base, it's www.amrit.coach/life. That's www.amrit.coach/life. There is a link in the show notes below to book in that call. And yeah, if you want to take your journey further, if you want to dive in deeper, and you really want to live a spiritually aligned life, if it's for you, please do check it out. And without too much further ado, once again, for your spirit, for yourself, today's podcast. So, having gone to the other side, and you at this moment where you were describing your memories were attached to music in some way, like you were being lifted up through music at times. And having done a few of these interviews, people that come back from their near-death experience seem to have this very visceral relationship with sound and frequency as part of healing as well. And it becomes that vibration and frequency. And I know Tesla said, if you want to understand the world, and, now it's sort of bantered around to the point where it's starting to get a bit cheesy, but it's interesting to sort of feel into those people that have had the near-death experience, just how intrinsic sound and vibration and frequency becomes part of their awareness. And I know, your partner's put out some really great like sound vibrational stuff in the world as well. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on sound, vibration, frequency. Maybe you can describe what was going on in that moment as well, because pillars of light are opening up. Sorry, I'll stop programming your answer.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, Amrit, because that really gets to the heart of the matters in so many ways. When I went into coma, I was actually working for the Focused Ultrasound Surgery Foundation. So I was working with sound, ultrasound, and then, of course, in my coma, I saw music as the way that I was actually seemed to have an influence on being able to traverse these various spiritual levels. And then coming back here, 2 years post-coma, I had read about 150 books, trying to figure out my experience, a lot of books on quantum physics, on mind and consciousness, neuroscience, spiritual traditions, East and West. But ultimately, I decided within 2 years of waking up from coma that I had to have my own pattern of daily meditation. If I was ever going to figure any of this out, I had to be exploring my own consciousness and gaining personal experience with conscious exploration. And that's when I heard about binaural beats. Binaural beats, first described by a Prussian physicist back in the 1800s. His name was Wilhelm Heinrich Dove. Anyway, in the late 20th century, Robert Monroe found out that binaural beats could be very effective at helping out-of-body experiences. Also, people interested in remote viewing found that binaural beats could be very helpful at setting the stage for successful remote viewing of distant, things distant in space and time. And so I knew enough about that to say, wow, this could be interesting. I read an article from Scientific American, I think it was October of 74 by Gerald Oster, and it was about binaural beats in the brain, and it was all about the anatomy of the brainstem that relates to all this. And to me, it looked like an incredibly powerful way to meditate, because every sound, every chant, anthem, or hymn you've ever heard in your life that might have induced a transcendental state of conscious awareness was processed up in the temporal auditory cortex in the temporal lobes, circuits that have basically been evolving the last 2 or 3 million years in Homo sapiens and primates. Very different is binaural beats. Those are being processed way down in the lower brainstem. Slight different frequency to the two ears, and in the lower brainstem they intersect and they can modulate activity in the lower brainstem. Modern neuroscience basically sees the brainstem as kind of coordinating conscious awareness. You have 40 times per second, you're firing up a now signal to kind of synchronize working of your phenomenal experience. And it turns out that if you start modulating that signaling system, that's how you can actually escape the kind of here and now and having your, just be going through the brain and mind processing, being in the body in the here and now. The way to escape that is by oscillating strongly in the lower brainstem. And that's what binaural beats do. And I've learned to just ride those waves beautifully, always to remind people that meditation is about silencing your little ego mind. This is not about your ego mind. Your ego mind might try and get away in the way of your meditation, and be a little voice of anxiety. But this is about acknowledging your kind of higher soul and the primordial mind that you can access by traversing that veil. And when you learn to ride the tones of sacred acoustics, you'll see what I mean. People can learn out a lot more, find out much more by going to sacredacoustics.com. Full disclosure, that's the website of my partner, Karen Newell, who also is the co-author of the book Living in a Mindful Universe, where we talk a lot about using binaural beats and sacred acoustics for effective journeying into spiritual endeavors, things like that. And I will point out that Dr. Anna Yusim, who's a New York psychiatrist, she did a pilot study in a peer-reviewed journal. It's now published in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, came out in February of 2020, where she found that binaural beats, sacred acoustics in particular, the whole mind bundle from sacredacoustics.com, which she used in the study, and she found that over 2 weeks, she found a 26% reduction in anxiety symptoms in her patients, compared to an only 7% reduction in the control group that got standard talk therapy for anxiety during those 2 weeks. So 26% listening to tones, very powerful effect for alleviating anxiety. And of course, once you start using them, you'll realize they do a lot more than alleviate anxiety. That effect is coming from silencing your little ego voice. All addictions and fears are all part of the ego. So once you kind of leave your little ego voice in time out and start moving to your higher soul, you start getting to a point where you don't have fear of death. You no longer suffer from addictions, which are absolutely an ego disease. And this is where we can grow into the souls we came here to be. But I know that Karen, she made that whole mind bundle that was the subject of that scientific study by Dr. Anna Yusim. Early in the pandemic is when that study came out. She knew a lot of people were suffering, anxiety with the pandemic and the economic challenges of the pandemic. So not only did she drop the price of the whole mind bundle on sacredacoustics.com to $19, which is an incredible bargain, but she also put up a free button. That was for people who might be so challenged by the pandemic or the economics of the pandemic that they didn't have any money to spare, but she knew they needed relief from anxiety. So she very generously left that whole mind bundle available on sacredacoustics.com with a free button, and that's still there. So Karen is a wonderful, loving soul, and she knows how to help the world. And that's what she and Sacred Acoustics are doing, is making these tones available to people. But once you check out the website, you'll realize there's a lot more than just that whole mind bundle. And she has a how-to page, I want to do this, ... And whatever you might want to do with meditation and with binaural beats, you'll find a pathway there that she lays out. But if you want to do that, well, then here are the tones to download. And there's a great app that Sacred Acoustics runs on. I listen to Sacred Acoustics an hour or two every day. I've been doing that for 11 or 12 years now. And I find them to be incredibly beneficial and helpful in my spiritual journeying, in my sense of well-being, in my maintenance of health, in my finding, spiritual guidance. Every bit of that is enhanced through Karen and her work with Sacred Acoustics.
Talking about spiritual guidance, there's a part of this conversation that just keeps popping back up in my awareness, which was when you were coming back and the 6 people that you saw, and one of them wasn't physically in the room with you. They had channeled themselves into that space to help guide you back. I'm not sure if there's even a question there. It keeps popping back up in my awareness.
Well, let me tell you her description of it.
Yeah.
I think it'll clarify things.
Please.
From Susan Renches. She's the family friend who I'd known back in 1972 in freshman English, and we reconnected years later, etc. And my family knew she had channeled to help people. And she wrote this book called Third Eye Open. That's all about her channeling experiences. But I ran into her about 6 months after my coma. and thanked her, for being there, for helping me, etc. And she told me that out of all of her experiences channeling to people in coma, that this was the most frightening of all. And the reason was, she used the analogy, she said, it's like I walk up to an oasis in the desert that has a well, and there's a rope coming out of it. And when I get there and she's doing her channeling thing, and she's having this vision of this oasis, and the way she pictures it is she starts pulling on the rope. Now, how much resistance is how much soul is left there to come back. So most of the time she pulls on the rope and there's a lot of resistance. In my case, she said I was so far gone that she pulled on the rope and it's almost like there was nothing still on the other end. And that's when she knew I was in deep trouble, that I was very far gone from this world, which certainly aligns with the medical case report and those medical details. This was a deadly case of severe gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis that absolutely should have killed me. It wasn't just a little baby case. This was a wicked case of meningitis. And she said it kind of terrified her, but she kept working, and she actually channeled to me on 2 nights, nights 4 and 5 of my 7-day coma, because she was so concerned and she wasn't sure she was seeing anything positive. And but anyway, she was there as clear as a bell, as clearly as the other people who were physically present in the ICU room. She was there in my memories of the experience. So I'm very grateful to Susan Renches for helping pull me out of all this.
What does that all say to you about the soul's journey and purpose? Were you always meant to have this near-death experience and come back? Because it seems like there was that sentiment echoed back that you're here, but you're going to be sent back. But what do NDEs at large, and also what's your personal experience of the soul's journey, the soul's purpose, and why we're all here?
Well, I think we're here. Basically, I love answering that question by simply stating that the entrance to the Oracle of Delphi in Greece, above the entrance to that temple, it says, "Know thyself." And I think that's essentially why we're all here, is to know ourselves. But it becomes far more interesting when you realize that you're sharing the mind of the universe and that we're all in this together. And so know thyself is to really know much more about you and everything around you and this universe at large and all the past, present, and future, and how all of it contributes to learning and teaching and coming to know ourselves much more fully. And of course, we're never alone. There's no such thing as a soul's growth. Souls grow in groups. We're all doing this. We're contributing, I would say. Essentially, I've come to realize that Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who wrote that book, The Phenomenon of Man, back in the mid-20th century, he was a French Jesuit priest, but he was also a paleontologist. So he was a scientist looking at billion-year timescales, and he had a rich spiritual training. So he recognized that all that discussion about evolution, Darwinian evolution in the mid-20th century, was true, but he also recognized what was coming out of the world of quantum physics and quantum mechanics, teaching deeply about things like space and time. And he recognized that there was an evolution going on, but it was much bigger than what the scientists of the day saw with evolution of biological systems on Earth. He saw it as the evolution of all consciousness. And I would say, just like that old saying, all politics is local, well, all evolution of consciousness throughout the cosmos is nothing more than individual sentient beings coming to a deeper and richer understanding of themselves in this universe at large. And I think that is what we've really got going on here, is a very grand picture of learning and teaching, evolution, transformation of understanding to the next level. And I would say that the current science of consciousness is reflecting kind of the next stage of a more than 5,000 year cycle of human evolution of understanding, to where we're going to get to a next level. And I would say that this revolution that we're discussing now about consciousness and the primacy of mind will make the Copernican revolution, where we came to see that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, but the sun seemed to be the center, that will look like child's play compared to where we're headed with this revolution. This one is really big. And this has everything to do with a deeper understanding of who we are as human beings, understanding our own existence, but also much more grandly, the existence of the universe at large and how we all fit into that. And that's what this is really all about. It's this tremendous process of transformation and growth. And the most essential features to get at this level are that it's all about oneness, that we're all in this together. If you hurt another, you're hurting yourself. And that this is all about that binding force of love that is so obvious in near-death experiences. In fact, near-death experiences will come back and tell you love is the only thing that matters. And of course, that message has gotten into our popular culture. The Beatles sang about it. Love is all you need. Dionne Warwick, we need a little more love. Well, they had it right. And the NDE community, and certainly the science of consciousness studies in the current era, greatly emphasizes the need for love, compassion, kindness, mercy, acceptance, when necessary, forgiveness. Don't forget about gratitude, and we're all in this together. And this current political polarization of nations fighting, war, all of that is an abomination that's only allowed because there are remnants of that bleak and paltry materialist sense of separation that are still around this world. Egos, narcissists, all of that kind of toxic, dysfunctional stuff goes the way of the dodo when we acknowledge consciousness is fundamental in the universe and that we're all in this together. So it's really time to grow up and mature as humanity and leave behind that bleak and paltry fiction of false sense of separation and materialism and grow into the souls we came here to be.
Can you describe what a gift of desperation is?
Ah, yes. Well, the gift of desperation is something very familiar to people in the addiction world. And what that means is when you hit a bottom that's low enough, like in alcoholism or drug abuse, what have you, it either kills you or you bounce off the bottom with enough energy to really grow and come back and make transformative changes in this world. So the gift of desperation is the gift of the bleak and dark hand that you deal yourself when you're slave to the demands of the ego. And the ego uses fear and anxiety as its main tools. And once we escape that and start getting on board with this kind of higher soul work that I'm talking about, we can leave all that bleak and paltry fiction of that ego-dominated addiction, narcissistic, kind of toxic world behind. It's the first thing I do in meditation, is I let my ego voice make a statement, ask a question, make a request, but then that ego voice goes into timeout. And I've learned to ride those sacred acoustics tones and focus on my breathing and get to very deep states of spiritual awareness that leave behind that petty little ego mind. Now, it turns out that the gift of desperation is not only a concept in addiction medicine, a very powerful concept in addiction medicine, but I would say it applies beautifully to our world today, to our world that still remains somewhat addicted to that materialist nonsense, in spite of the fact that it brings us so much misery and discomfort. But now we can awaken to a much grander sense of soul and higher soul, more connected with that God force that has tremendous power to bring love and healing into our lives today. And that's where this gift of desperation should help all of society climb out of the smoking hole of where materialism will lead us with all these toxic egos, with profit motive dominating, taking care of human beings, which should be our primary interest. Every company on earth should be focusing on making the world a better place for humans, not on profit. The profit will come naturally if you do things right. And it's time for us to let go of those kind of sick narcissistic egos, the profit motive that has led so much of this world into a very kind of a dark and dismal place, because we can resurrect a much brighter, more promising, harmonious, and prosperous future for all involved by acknowledging the oneness of mind and the binding power of love.
Whoa. Thank you so much for sharing that. When it comes to the binding power of love, I I don't know how to ask a question about Indra's net. I'm just fascinated. I want to know more. There are so many
That really,
concepts woven into. Sorry,
what
yeah, I'll stop.
what that showed me was just this the interconnection and that binding force of love in a very kind of visual structural form, and yet it seems so natural when you think about it. If we can have loving relationships with a few people, we should be able to have loving relationships with a lot of people, especially as we try to help each other and focus on the higher good. And so to me, all of that makes perfect sense and starts building towards a world where we can expect prosperity and happiness and joy and bliss to see for all of our fellow beings. And important to point out that this scientific revolution about consciousness is not just about human consciousness. What it reminds us is that our animal friends are part of this conscious world, as are plants. And when I say that, what I mean is there's going to be a day of reckoning where we're going to have to kind of reassess how we treat animals, and that's especially in our food industry. We, the misuse and abuse of animals as we treat them for our food industry is abominable, and it must be reversed. It will be over time as more and more of us come to accept this deeper reality. But I'm not saying that animals eating animals is part of the natural order, and humans are omnivores. They're not carnivores. They're not herbivores. But the way we treat animals in the food industry, with the caging, with their whole life spent incarcerated, I mean, to me, that's abominable. And that is what someday must come to an end as we come to address the spiritual nature of ourselves and of the animal kingdom and of our, when we're considering our food supply chain and that kind of thing.
There's a last little bit that I wanted to just open up was, again, it's reflecting back on something we were discussing before, and it's just back in my awareness, which is this concept of the non-localized version of ourself. Because the fact that our memories aren't contained within our mind, and actually just quick little tangent, today's conversation has just been like, I'm not sure the logo of the inspired evolution should remain to be the mind, the brain, sorry. But nonetheless, coming back...
It should be brain. I promise you it's not brain, because brain is where memories are stored. It's not even where consciousness is created.
We also had...
elsewhere.
Because we also had Dr. Rupert Sheldrake on the podcast, and he was talking about the morphogenetic fields and how we happen to be the closest signatory match to the field that stores our particular memories, and that's kind of how psychics work as well. They can emulate your match and sort of go in and have a suss around of your memories as well. It's just a fascinating concept to just go, oh yeah, there's potentially a non-localized version of myself, and whether that's in Indra's net, I'm just fascinated.
Well, it's basically universal. There are no limits. Just that, like there are no limits to the quantum field of the universe, there are no limits to our conscious awareness in space and time. And that is a very key ingredient, and that's part of why exploring consciousness through meditation and centering prayer can be so rewarding and exciting.
Last little question, earth time versus deep time. Because you mentioned that lightly earlier on, there seems to be earth time on one hand, but then something else you refer to as deep time. Can you highlight the difference between the two and explain deep time?
Well, certainly I think it becomes clear to anybody when you start talking about near-death experiences and you start talking about life reviews. And when you realize that life reviews, and I'm not just speaking from my knowledge of life reviews, but harvesting Bruce Grayson's experience. He's a skeptical psychiatrist who has studied NDEs for 45 years or more. And in the fall of 2021, in the Journal of Near-Death Studies, he published qualities of life reviews. And interestingly enough, I think it was something like 74% of life reviews and that would have been 700 life reviews in his database, 74% describe the life review as from the perspective of everybody involved. Now, that's a very important point. In other words, when you go through your life review, if you've been handing pain and suffering out to others, you get to feel that. You have to be on the receiving end of it. Of
Whoa.
course, if you hand out a lot of love and kindness, you get to receive that too. But that's why the life review is like the golden rule written into the fabric of the universe. Treat others as you would like to be treated. If you hurt another, you're hurting yourself. This is what life reviews and NDEs are teaching us, the binding force of love. Now, I'll also point out that almost half of those 700 life reviews that Bruce reports, he talks about they say it's a reliving, not remembering of events, but a reliving. And something like a third of people said they relived their entire life. Now, that might sound difficult or challenging, for somebody who has a cardiac arrest and they're unconscious for 8 or 10 minutes and then they're brought back to life. How do you go through your whole life in those 8 minutes? Well, it turns out the timeless nature of that realm allows all of that to happen and more. You need to pay attention to the words people use to describe life reviews to begin to understand just how powerful a mode of existence that is in this universe. That we can witness our entire life, and it's from the perspective of everybody involved in everything that ever happened in our life. And not only that, but it's a reliving and not just a remembering. So that involves an ability to kind of adjust the various features as you go. But the life review is a beautiful kind of ingredient to our existence because it allows for a course correction, for us to become more loving, kind, and compassionate with our fellow beings. And that is the general trend over time, because ultimately, these life reviews, this whole broad aspect of NDEs and what they're informing us about the nature of our existence, that evidence only gets stronger and stronger all the time. Just like those Bigelow Institute essays. They give you a tremendous amount of data to start with, but people every day are living these very same things. Near-death experiences, shared death experiences, which are just like near-death, but happen in perfectly healthy people, usually a loved one at a distance, or even a healthcare worker who's working with a dying patient. But all of that is about connection, about this broader kind of model of mind and of this God mind. And it's really all about that love. And that's why paying attention to all of this, and ultimately, now that science is paying big attention to it, the world is going to shift. And you have to incorporate quantum physics, neuroscience, philosophy of mind, parapsychology, and all the evidence for non-local consciousness like telepathy, remote viewing. This is all stuff we put together in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, to unite science and spirituality in a very powerful fashion, fully supporting the philosophical position of evolutionary panentheism. And that's where this world is headed.
Oh, definitely.
And that is very good news for all of us as human beings, because it will lead to a much more harmonious and resonant world.
I'll definitely put a link to the book in the description below for people to go ahead and check out and grab a copy. Very insightful read. One of the things in and around there is I just couldn't help but remark as you were sharing this, how deeply the life review and what it reveals for us, if we all had this visceral awareness of what our life review was going to feel like, in terms of it wasn't just us feeling what we felt in our life, but feeling it through the other's lens in terms of how we made them feel. If everybody had a visceral felt sense of that, just how we would conduct ourselves, carrying ourselves through our life, the amount of compassion, grace, and just care and empathy we'd be walking with would just, I imagine that would revolutionize the world overnight if everybody had that awareness.
You're right on target, Amrit. That is the key. And I think that's why it's so crucial to point out life, near-death experiences are not just important because they tell us what happens when we die, but far more importantly, they inform us how to live every moment, every breath of this existence, and how to treat ourselves and others with the respect due, because we are sacred, divine, eternal, spiritual beings, all living together in a spiritual universe. So that is the deep and profound scientific truth about the nature of consciousness that will absolutely make this world a far better place.
Dr. Eben. Wow. Thank you so much for your time, your energy, your presence here today. And, I can obviously, thank you for today. And I want to say thank you for today. And yet it just feels like a grain of sand on a beach. There is so much of your experiences, the collective experiences that you studied, fellow scientists, fellow NDEs that, weaves itself into the awareness and the understanding. We get to stand on the shoulders of all of that today here in these conversations. So yes, thank you for your time and energy here today. Absolutely. But also thank you for who you are and the way just your journey and the way you're championing the awarenesses that you are for us to step into.
Thank you so much for what you do, for getting this out to the world, for running your podcast and getting all these guests to help contribute to this picture. You're doing a great job. So thanks for all you do too.
That means so much to me. Thank you so much. Inspired soul, you've made it all the way through to the end of another episode. On screen right now is the opportunity to continue your inspirations to evolve. There are 3 other episodes on screen for you to continue your journey and viewing pleasure and experience. And as always, please don't forget to hit subscribe to the channel. This entire channel is powered by you taking the time to hit subscribe. So thank you so much in advance for that. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.